The Chicago skyline glowed like a promise under the pre-dawn sky, its towering spires piercing the last threads of night. Inside the gleaming fortress of Pinnacle Enterprises, Carlos Mendez, a 52-year-old janitor with weathered hands and eyes, that held 1,000 untold stories, pushed his cleaning cart through the silent 42nd floor. The hum of his vacuum was a lonely anthem, filling the vast, empty corridors of the corporate empire. His gray uniform blended into the shadows, just as he had for 3 years, unnoticed by the suits who breezed past him daily. But this morning, as the first rays of sun slipped through the floor-to-ceiling windows, something stirred, a moment that would unravel destinies and shake the foundations of a world built on ambition. Carlos moved with quiet precision, his mop tracing arcs across the marble floor, each stroke a ritual of survival. He hummed a melody from his childhood in Guatemala, a lilting tune his mother sang while weaving baskets under the sprawling arms of a ceiba tree. The notes were soft, almost swallowed by the sterile hum of the building, but they carried a warmth that felt out of place in the cold glass tower. He didn't hear the faint ding of the elevator or the sharp click of polished loafers approaching. David Whitaker, Pinnacle's 38-year-old CEO, strode through the hall, his mind a storm of calculations for a high-stakes merger that could redefine his legacy. Sleepless and driven, he'd come early to escape the noise of his own thoughts, but the faint hum stopped him cold. "Who's here at this hour?" David muttered, his voice sharp with the edge of a man who commanded boardrooms. He peered into the conference room, its mahogany table gleaming under Carlos's careful hands. Carlos froze, the vacuum's drone cutting off abruptly. "Good morning, sir," he said, his English accented but steady, his eyes meeting David's for a fleeting moment before dropping respectfully. "Just finishing up." David, usually too consumed to notice anyone below his pay grade, felt an odd tug of curiosity. "That song," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "What is it?" Carlos hesitated, his fingers tightening around the vacuum handle. "Something from home, sir. Guatemala. My mother's song." David's brow arched. In his world, time was currency, and small talk was a luxury he rarely afforded. Yet something about Carlos's quiet dignity held him there. "Guatemala, huh? Speak any other languages?" he asked, half expecting a quick shake of the head. Carlos's lips curved into a shy, almost reluctant smile. "A few, sir," he said, as if confessing a secret he'd long buried. Then, in a voice soft but sure, he listed them. Spanish, English, Portuguese, French, Italian, German, Arabic, Mandarin, and a little Russian. The words hung in the air, each one a spark that lit up the dim room. David's laugh was sharp, disbelieving. 9 languages? From the man who cleaned his office? "You're pulling my leg," he said, crossing his arms. "Say something in Mandarin." Carlos didn't flinch. He spoke, his voice like a river, smooth and flowing, a phrase about the dawn painting the sky with hope. Then, in Arabic, he offered a greeting, its cadence like a prayer for peace. David's skepticism crumbled, replaced by a flicker of awe. This wasn't just a janitor. This was a mystery wrapped in a gray uniform. "How?" David demanded, stepping closer, the merger forgotten. "How do you know all this?" Carlos's eyes drifted to the window, where the city's pulse beat below. His story spilled out, each word a thread pulled from a tapestry of a life unseen. Born in a Guatemalan village where the jungle whispered secrets, Carlos had been a prodigy, his mind a sponge for languages. By 10, he was mimicking missionaries' French. By 15, he was translating Portuguese for traders passing through. A battered shortwave radio brought him German and Russian, voices crackling through the night air. At 20, he was teaching children in his village, dreaming of a university, of a life where his gifts could shine. But then war came, a brutal tide that swept away his family, his home, his future. He fled to the U.S., a refugee with nothing but his languages and a stubborn will to survive. David listened, his polished exterior cracking like ice under a spring thaw. Construction sites, dishwashing shifts. Now this. Decades of labor that buried Carlos's brilliance under the weight of necessity. Languages, Carlos said, his voice barely above a whisper. They're my way of holding on to the world. I lost. The words hit David like a physical blow. He'd built Pinnacle on efficiency, on numbers that danced to his tune, but this was something else entirely. Here was a man who carried a universe in his mind, invisible to the empire David ruled. The realization was a spark, igniting questions he'd never dared ask. Who else had he overlooked? What stories lived in the shadows of his success? David thanked Carlos, his voice quieter than usual, and left the room, his mind a whirlwind. By 9 a.m., he'd canceled his morning calls and summoned his executive team to the boardroom. The air crackled with tension as they gathered, their faces, a mix of curiosity and irritation at the cryptic agenda. David stood, his usual commanding presence softened by something raw, almost vulnerable. "We're missing something," he began, his voice cutting through the room's hum. "We chase profits, build empires, but we're blind to the people who hold this place together." He told Carlos's story, not as a spectacle, but as a mirror held up to their own ignorance. The executives shifted, some skeptical, others intrigued. Then came the bombshell. "I'm creating a new role, Director of Cultural Engagement, and I'm offering it to Carlos Mendez." The room erupted in gasps, murmurs rippling like a stone. Dropped in still water. A janitor? In a C-suite? "He has no degree," one executive protested, her voice tight. "No corporate experience?" another added, his tone edged with disdain. David's eyes flashed, his voice like steel. "He has something better. Humanity. And if we can't see that, we're the ones who don't belong here." The silence that followed was heavy, each executive wrestling with the weight of his words. David wasn't just proposing a promotion, he was challenging the very soul of Pinnacle. Word of the decision spread like wildfire, whispers racing through, cubicles and break rooms. By noon, the office buzzed with speculation. Carlos, oblivious, was polishing a window on the 30th floor when HR called him down. In a sterile office, they laid out the offer. A title, a salary that dwarfed his current, pay, a chance to use his languages to connect Pinnacle's global offices. Carlos's mop clattered to the floor, his breath catching. "Me? But I'm just—" He couldn't finish, his mind reeling. The HR manager's smile was kind but firm. "You're not just anything, Carlos. Mr. Whitaker sees that." Overwhelmed, Carlos asked for a day to think, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and a hope he hadn't felt in decades. That night, in his modest apartment, Carlos sat with his wife Elena and their teenage daughter Sophia. The kitchen table was scarred from years of shared meals, a silent witness to their struggles. He told them everything, his voice trembling as he recounted. David's offer. Elena, who'd worked double shifts as a nurse to keep them afloat, reached for his hand, her eyes brimming. "You've always been more than they saw," she whispered, her voice thick with pride. Sophia, usually lost in her phone, looked up, her face alight. "Dad, you could change things for people like us." Her words were a spark, kindling a fire in Carlos's chest. He'd spent years hiding his light, dimming himself to fit into a world that didn't see him. But now, for the first time, he felt the weight of possibility. As the clock ticked past midnight, Carlos lay awake, his mother's song echoing in his mind. The melody carried memories of a life lost, but also a promise, of a world where his gifts could matter. He didn't know if he was ready, but he knew he couldn't turn back. Tomorrow he would step into the unknown, carrying the hopes of his family and the weight of a chance to rewrite his story. The Chicago dawn broke with a fierce glow, painting the Pinnacle Enterprises tower in hues of gold and possibility. Carlos Mendez stood before his bathroom mirror, his reflection framed by cracked tiles, his hands trembling as he adjusted the tie Elena had knotted for him. The suit, borrowed from a neighbor, hung slightly loose on his frame, but it carried a weight of its own, a symbol of a world he'd never dared enter. At 52, after decades of mops and midnight shifts, he was no longer just the janitor. Today, he would walk into Pinnacle as the Director of Cultural Engagement, a title that felt like a dream stitched together with fragile hope. The office buzzed with whispers of his promotion, and every eye would be on him, waiting to see if he'd rise or crumble. The air crackled with anticipation, and Carlos felt it in his bones. This was no ordinary morning. He stepped into the elevator. At 7 a.m., the glass walls reflecting a man he barely recognized. His heart thudded as the floors ticked upward, each ding a countdown to a reckoning. Yesterday's decision to accept David Whitaker's offer had been a leap into the unknown, fueled by Elena's tears and Sophia's fierce belief. But doubt gnawed at him now. What did he, a man who'd spent years invisible, know about leading? The elevator doors slid open on the 42nd floor, and the hum of the office hit him like a wave. Phones ringing, keyboards clacking, voices sharp with corporate urgency. Heads turned as he stepped out, their stares a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and something softer, like hope. Carlos straightened, clutching the memory of his mother's song to steady himself. David Whitaker waited in the executive suite, his office a cathedral of glass and steel overlooking the city's pulse. The CEO, usually a fortress of confidence, felt a flicker of nerves. His decision to promote Carlos had sparked a firestorm, executives whispering about optics, employees buzzing with rumors. He'd staked his reputation on a man most had never noticed, and the weight of that choice pressed against him. When Carlos entered, David rose, his smile genuine but edged with intensity. "Ready to change the world, Carlos?" he asked, his voice carrying the challenge of a man who'd bet everything on this moment. Carlos nodded, his throat tight. "I'll try, sir. For my family. For everyone who's been unseen." The first meeting was a trial by fire. David had assembled the global team, executives from London, Tokyo, Dubai, and Sao Paulo, their faces, flickering on a massive screen. They expected a polished strategist, not a former janitor with calloused hands. Carlos stood, his notes trembling slightly in his grip, and began in English, his accent a soft reminder of his roots. "We are more than our titles," he said, his voice steadying. "I've cleaned your offices, but I've also carried 9 languages, each one a bridge to someone's story." He switched to Mandarin, greeting the Tokyo team with a proverb about unity. In Arabic, he spoke of shared dreams to Dubai. In Portuguese, he welcomed Sao Paulo with warmth. The room fell silent, the executives' skepticism melting into something like awe. But not everyone was swayed. Margaret Voss, the odd CFO, leaned back, her arms crossed. "Impressive parlor trick," she said, her voice cutting. "But can you deliver results?" The question hung like a blade, and Carlos felt the weight of every doubt he'd ever carried. He met her gaze, his voice low but firm. "Results come from people, not just numbers. I've seen this company from the shadows. Every cleaner, every clerk has a gift you've never asked about. Let me show you what we can do together." The room shifted, a ripple of respect passing through even the hardest faces. David's eyes gleamed. He'd chosen right. The news of Carlos's speech spread faster than the morning coffee run. By noon, employees clustered in break rooms, their whispers turning to stories. A receptionist admitted she'd studied astrophysics before life derailed her. A mailroom clerk shared his poetry, scribbled on napkins during breaks. Carlos's presence was a spark, igniting a hunger to be seen. David, watching the buzz from his office, felt a surge of something he hadn't in years: hope. He called Carlos in, his voice urgent. "This is bigger than I thought," he said. "I want you to lead an initiative. Call it Hidden Talent. Find the gifts in our people, Carlos. Build something real." Carlos's chest tightened. This wasn't just a job. It was a chance to rewrite the rules. The next weeks were a whirlwind. Carlos, still adjusting to his office with its view of Lake Michigan, threw himself into the work. He met with employees one-on-one, listening to their stories in whatever language they chose. In French, a security guard confessed his love for classical piano. In Spanish, a data analyst shared her unpublished novel. Each conversation was a thread, weaving a tapestry of humanity that Pinnacle had never seen. Carlos's warmth, his quiet way of making people feel valued, turned strangers into allies. He proposed language classes, mentorship programs, even partnerships with local schools to lift up kids like Sophia, who dreamed beyond their circumstances. The office began to hum with a new energy, as if the walls themselves were waking up. But the path wasn't smooth. Some executives resisted, grumbling about soft initiatives stealing focus from profits. At a board meeting, Margaret cornered Carlos, her voice icy. "This is a business, not a charity. Your ideas cost money we don't have." Carlos didn't flinch. "People are your money," he said, his eyes steady. "Ignore them, and you lose more than dollars." He pulled out a report, his first, painstakingly crafted with Sophia's help, showing how employee engagement had spiked, errors dropped, and global teams collaborated like never before. Margaret's lips tightened, but she said nothing. The numbers spoke, and Carlos's voice was louder than she'd expected. The emotional crescendo came at Pinnacle's annual gala, a glittering affair in a Chicago ballroom where chandeliers cast diamonds of light across the crowd. David had insisted Carlos speak, a first for someone outside the C-suite. As Carlos took the stage, the room hushed, hundreds of eyes, executives, interns, caterers, fixed on him. He stood, no longer invisible, his suit now tailored, his presence commanding. In 9 languages, he wove a message that cut to the heart. "We all carry gifts, seen or unseen. When we lift each other, we rise together." His voice broke on the last line. Memories of his mother, his village, his long-buried dreams flooding back. Tears streaked faces in the crowd. A waiter set down his tray, clapping fiercely. Margaret, seated near the front, wiped her eyes, her defenses crumbling. David, standing at the back, felt his throat tighten. He'd started this to right a wrong, but it had changed him too. He saw Pinnacle not as a machine, but as a living thing, pulsing with the stories of its people. Carlos's speech ended with a call. "Share your gifts. See each other. That's how we build a future." The applause was thunderous, shaking the room like a heartbeat. Employees embraced, strangers became friends, and the air buzzed with a shared vision. Carlos stepped off the stage, Elena and Sophia waiting in the wings, their pride a light brighter than the chandeliers. By spring, Pinnacle was transformed. Carlos's Hidden Talent initiative had sparked mentorships, community projects, and a culture where no one felt invisible. Profits soared, not from mergers, but from people who felt valued, who gave their best because they were seen. Carlos, now a mentor to dozens, stood at his office window, the city sprawling below. His mother's song played in his mind, no longer a lament, but a celebration. He'd carried it through decades of darkness, and now it echoed in a place he'd never imagined he'd belong. The world hadn't just seen him, it had changed because of him. And in every heart that heard his story, a spark ignited. The belief that one act of kindness, one moment of seeing, could light up the world.